Welcome back, friends. I am joined today by Chris Sanders with Designed Realty. Welcome, Chris. Thank you for joining. And today we're going to talk about navigating multiple offers in the seller's market, primarily from a seller perspective and what sellers are looking for. This is a good opportunity for buyers to listen and understand what a seller is looking for. So let's dive into some questions that we got. First of all, the big one, which kind of covers everything, how should sellers evaluate multiple offers beyond just the highest price?
Yeah, it's a good question and a very, very common question. With these type of nuanced conversations, I always start off with, what does the seller want? Because you know what? If it's seller living in his house, he has all of his furniture, he doesn't know where he's going yet, he might need 30, 45, 60 days to get out. But if it's their third vacation home on the beach and they just want out their balance books, buy one, get rid of it in 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So with evaluating this stuff, I always like to reach out to either my seller or the seller and be like, hey, what do you want? Sometimes, specifically in the Seattle market, we tend to see a disproportionate number of vacant homes. So oftentimes, quick closing is what the sellers are looking for.
Yeah, I think you're probably right on that for most of ours. I think because most people know that they're going to sell fairly quickly, they just move out and don't have to deal with the hassle of it. But I think when you do find the homes where people are still living in, especially we see that in the fall and winter, where it might be a little less active, it's definitely worth checking what they need and, possibly even a rent back. An extra week or a month in the home, typically at no cost, where they just become tenants for a month, and that gives them time to move out, get their money, buy their new home, all that kind of stuff. And if they're lucky, they can time it all just right. What about financing and the lender you choose? Do you have any thoughts on that?
First, I do like to hedge my sellers a little bit, tell them, like, look, a financed offer at the end of the day, if it closes, is a cash offer. So if we have one cash offer that's significantly below a finance offer, I'm probably not going to recommend the finance or the cash offer right away, just because it's cash.
Right.
So first of all, with finance, I like to look at, obviously, purchase price, closing date, all of that stuff. But I also like to look at the lender. If I have multiple offers or even just one offer, I'm probably going to call up that loan officer and talk to him about the file. See if I can get any additional information, just make sure that the lender knows what they're doing, that they've actually pre-approved to verify yes. But generally, if they're apples to apples, I'd probably take the cash offer. But like I said, if the cash offer is lower than finance, I'd dig a bit deeper, and I probably would recommend against taking it just because it's cash.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like I said, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. And the only real difference is potentially closing period. If you need to close fast, cash can close faster, although most lenders we work with can close really fast these days. I think the only other thing that really comes into my evaluation of that is depending on the financing and the condition of the home. If it's kind of a fixer-upper and we're looking at FHA, getting through that appraisal might be a little bit more difficult. That would be, I think, for me, the only other consideration. But I'm with you. Otherwise, if none of that's a concern, I don't care. Get the best terms.
Yeah, Joe, I definitely agree with that. The financing does add a little bit more of a question mark to the whole conversation. But at the same point, I've seen deals come across with a proof of funds that ended up being fraudulent.
That's true.
It was cash in 7 days, and it turns out they weren't closing at all.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And when you look at that, in fact, yes, I have had that. And also, knock on wood, I've never had a failed financing. So there's that. And on that note, too, we do have another video talking about the difference between pre-qualification, pre-underwriting. And one thing I think buyers should all know is that if you have a pre-qualification, it's not worth the paper it's printed on. Everybody knows that in our market. And if you come in with pre-qualification, just throw it in the trash and try it without, you're probably better off. But I do think that pre-underwriting, like one of our lenders, Build Mortgage, they do pre-underwriting and then they offer a $20,000 earnest money guarantee, which is pretty fantastic. And I know as a listing agent, I would love to see that, mostly because I know that lender's putting some skin in the game. If they weren't confident, they wouldn't be putting 20 grand of their own money on the line. And so I think that that's pretty important. And the pre-underwriting basically just means that, everything has been vetted. The buyer has been vetted. All they have to do is plug in the house and make sure that everything's good there. So yeah, definitely a lot of considerations. As far as down payment, I don't know about you, but for me, doesn't really factor in again, unless we're in a situation where, maybe we are worried about a low appraisal and I want to know how much cash reserve they have, but do you have any thoughts on?
Outside of that, not really. I might care a little bit more about the loan type, but at the same point, if it's an FHA VA, I'm not turning it away if it's the only thing I have in hand.
Yeah.
As long as they have enough money to get the loan closed, that's all my clients I would really care about.
Yeah, I agree. Good point on the VA too. I think another misconception is that VA loans are somehow worse, but they're actually not.
Yeah.
VA buyers tend to be actually overall I think their credit scores tend to be on average like 30 points higher than other buyers.
Just
Yeah, there's actually some really fascinating things, especially with military folks, because they basically live and work in a very high discipline environment. They don't just have creditors coming if they miss payments. If it gets too bad, their CEO is going to start yelling at them and tell them to get their stuff in gear. So I've seen some really interesting stats on that, and I love VA loans. And I highly recommend any seller does not look down at VA loans. Like that's probably one of your best options out there, especially if they're pre-underwritten with it. What about some other things like closing period? We kind of talked about that. What sellers need. What about earnest money? Do you have any advice on earnest money? How much? What strategies there might be around that?
Yeah, totally. So it's going to be completely dependent on market conditions, in my opinion. I know our opinions differ a little bit on how little earnest money a buyer should put down in a non-competitive situation. Personally, if I see a home that's been on market for a long time, I'm going to do my best to negotiate for the buyers, and that includes the earnest money. So I might assume like, hey, 1.5%, 2%, totally fine. Now, in today's market conditions, I'm not having percent. Today, it's all right. We're doing 3 to 5%, and I mentioned 5% specifically because that's the max a seller could keep in a traditional earnest money scenario. So as far as it comes to like negotiating strategy, getting your offer accepted or choosing an offer, I'd like to see higher earnest money on the listing side.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, one thing, especially with buyers, I think it's important to know is as long as we're doing everything else right, your earnest money it's not really a risk unless you're, going to be flaky and back out, that kind of thing. Ideally, we're protecting them. But your way. Yes.
Never had it out.
Yes. And the other thing is releasing earnest money. There's kind of like two steps in that. And I know like some agents kind of talk about just releasing it, which does not mean that the buyer can't get it back. And I think, you have to make sure, especially from a seller standpoint, that if it says released, okay, now you get to deposit that check in your bank account, but that doesn't mean that the buyer can't terminate and get the money back. If they're going to do that, it has to become a non-refundable deposit.
Misconception in the industry.
Yeah. And then understanding that when it is non-refundable, it's non-refundable unless the seller does something wrong. What about inspections? I think inspections are, as the sort of get out of jail free card contingency in an offer. What are some ways to kind of get around that so the seller doesn't have to worry about you being flaky on it?
So again, in this spring market where we're starting to get really busy, multiple offers, I usually have my sellers do a pre-inspection, a seller procured inspection. And I'll give that to the buyer and say, hey, run with this. If it entices you to waive your inspection contingency, cool. If it doesn't, I'm not worried about it. I very much like to be able to sleep well at night, and I like to give, when I'm on the list side, the buyers the opportunity to do their due diligence. So if the only offers we have come across the table are with inspection contingencies, I'm okay with it.
Yeah.
Granted, I might try and negotiate like the timelines. I might look at the rest of the deal, see how we could impact that. But overall, as a listing agent, I'm okay with inspections. And of course, on the buy side, we do everything we can to include them.
Definitely. If the seller hasn't done a pre-inspection, also a buyer can still do their own too, a pre-inspection so that they can then waive it in the offer. And at least may not be able to negotiate, but then you know what's going on. You know the status of the home. You mentioned timeframes. What's a typical inspection timeframe? Like, how could you button that up? What would that look like?
Yeah, so in a standard, maybe balanced market scenario, I would expect for 5-day inspection contingencies to come through, potentially with an additional 5 days for additional inspections. And you know what? As a buyer's agent, that's usually what I write in when we're not under the gun. If I were to get a 5-day inspection contingency, I'd probably try and negotiate it down to a 3-day inspection contingency with maybe another 3-day additional inspections period. That gives us a little bit more security, and that will be off market for a shorter amount of time if they do end up terminating and trying to play hardball.
Yeah, you can jump right back on the market and move on. And then one other thing that is often overlooked is broker relationships. Do you have any opinions on those?
Totally. I personally have gotten multiple offers accepted over higher offers with better terms, specifically because I had a good relationship with that broker. Now, whether it's because I chatted with him about that specific listing or because we worked together in the past, it is a huge factor.
Yes. Examples of how not to do it. Sometimes buyer's agents will just send a link to download, not even the actual file, just send a link to download and no phone calls, no text, nothing. And it's just out of the blue and you know nothing about the agent or the buyer, except that the agent kind of appears lazy, which is not really what you're looking for. Now, again, if it's the only offer you got, you work through it. But if you're in a multiple offer situation, then yeah, that's not going to cut it. In my opinion, there are other things I would give up to have a relationship with an agent who I know is actually going to get the deal done. Obviously, if it's 100 grand, we're not going to do that, but we'll take our licks as we go.
Of course, it's the seller's choice as well, but I'm definitely biased in one way or the other in that regard.
Yeah, and I do actually, when I sit down with my sellers, we have a conversation. Part of the evaluation, we go through terms, and then who's this agent? And again, with a lender, what's the relationship with them? Are they responsive? Are they local? Are they, are we reviewing offers at 3 p.m., but the loan officer won't answer their phone because they're on the East Coast and, they went home at 2 p.m. our time. That's a big factor. And then what would you say are the most common mistakes that sellers make when they're evaluating multiple offers?
Interesting question. I would say a lot of the times we'll focus in solely on purchase price, not look at some of the other things, like specifically the inspection contingency. You mentioned it's our get out of jail free card.
Right.
Well, it's also our hit you over the head with a baseball bat card.
It's true.
I have seen situations where someone will come in way high over asking just to get their offer accepted. And then as soon as inspection negotiations start, they'll go, we want 200K off the purchase price. And sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't, depending on the scenario. As a listing agent representing the seller, I don't want to get stuck on that specifically.
Right. Totally. Yeah, that's a good point. And then we didn't really talk about escalation clause, but let's talk about that. How does the escalation work? What do you have any tips on that, or like what do you generally recommend?
Yeah, so I like escalations a lot personally on the buy side. Essentially, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, Mr. Seller, we will buy your house at $1 million, but we are willing to be any offer above ours by, for example, $10,000. However, under no event will we pay more than $1.2 million. So it's kind of giving the seller a roadmap for our offer to be automatically increased while still having a hard ceiling that we won't surpass. Like I said, as a buyer's agent, I like them. It hedges our bet a little bit. As a listing agent, I like seeing them come through, but I don't specifically like the form. So oftentimes what I'll do, or I'll recommend the listing agent does if I'm on the buy side, I'll say, hey, go ahead and strike the form, send me back the offer that would have increased my client's offer, and send us a counter offer at that price, what it would have been at the max. And we'll go ahead and sign off. We call it honoring the spirit of the escalation without having the back doors.
Yeah. And for those watching, that's because the escalation forms are confusing and they seem to get more confusing by the year. And what we don't want to do is have two different ideas of what we're doing on that form and then have a disagreement on what the price is. So at least when we do the way you suggested, there's no question. We know what the price is. It is what it is. There's not going to be any back and forth or regrets. Well, I shouldn't say any regrets, but at least not on incorrect calculations later.
It avoids ambiguity, which is one of the things we strive to do.
Yeah.
Specifically dealing with contracts and potential lawsuits. If we can get rid of any and all ambiguity, that's what we try to do.
Definitely. What about escalation increments? I generally recommend about 1% to beat other offers. Do you give that same advice, or do you have a different formula you use? Or
1% is usually about what I recommend. Yeah, I agree with you about that.
And I will say, like, sometimes if your offer is weaker in other areas, you might have to go stronger. If we know we're competing against a cash offer, we might go with a little bit higher escalation increments, like you said, to entice them to, forget the cash offer. Look, we're throwing money at this. Sometimes we do that too. And I will say once in a while, maybe a little bit less if it's significantly lower priced home and, competition isn't going to be huge, but I think 1% is generally good. How do you determine what that maximum is?
It's totally to clients. That is a scenario where I talk to the clients, I try and get a gauge for what they're comfortable with, and then I send them back to our lender. I say, let's talk to the lender about this. Again, going back to the sleeping well at night, I do not want them to move in and day one go, oh my God, we overdid
they do
for this monthly payment. What did we do?
Yeah.
So I want to make sure that's all ironed out on the front end, that they're very comfortable with that very max, both cash to close, the down payment and closing costs, and the monthly payment.
Definitely. I also, we haven't really talked about appraisals in this, but when you're escalating, obviously you can escalate way above what a home will appraise at. And one strategy I use with my buyers and sellers both is, okay, what do I think the maximum this home will appraise for? So at least for my buyers, they know, okay, if we are escalating over that, risk of appraisal issue, but also for my sellers, I've had certain situations where I have a ton of offers and the top 5 all go way over what I know it's going to appraise at. None of them are cash, they're all financed. So there will be an appraisal. And at that point, even if you go to the very high end, it's like, okay, we still have 4 offers that they're basically all equal, because you can offer 100,000 over. If you have to have an appraisal and you're not waiving it, they're all equal. until you start going to other terms.
That's probably the number one scenario where a cash offer does feed out a financed offer.
Yeah.
Because again, in a financed offer with a really big escalation and you do run the risk of a low appraisal, the seller's stuck holding the bag if the appraisal contingency is included.
Yeah.
Like the seller can either walk away or agree to come down to the appraised price.
Right.
Or explore them generally.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Definitely a consideration if the escalations are going wild. What about, we're just talking about this, the personal letters, the love letters from buyers to sellers. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So our opinions differ on this a little bit as well. As a listing agent, I usually won't present them to sellers, or I'll ask seller permission not to present them, just because I want nothing but the terms of the offer to be swaying their decisions. Whereas on the buy side, it's like, cool, we'll send them. I fully expect them to get thrown in the trash, but yeah, I'll include your love letter. Why not?
Yeah, we're pretty much on the same page with that, because the love letter it costs nothing.
Yeah.
It's a freebie we can throw in there. If it makes a difference, great. If they throw it out, whatever, it's a piece of paper. And on the sell side, a very similar thing. I ask my sellers to, if I can withhold the letters, let's make a decision. Then if you want to review the letters, at that point, I've never had anybody change their mind. I think once they've gone through a logical process of making a decision, I think it becomes harder to backtrack and then make it an emotional thing. And most of my sellers are like, yeah, actually, we don't even want to read them. Once in a while, I did have one sort of seller at the very, very end, like day of closing, they're like, can we see those letters? We're just curious what they all were, which is really interesting. And, it's just that morbid human curiosity, I guess. Obviously, way too late to change anything, but also on the buy side, I mean, let's be real. Letters can only say so much. We all give the same advice. Hopefully, I mean, in a good scenario, we've got a bunch of good buyers agents. They're all writing almost the exact same letter anyways. We love your home. You've taken great care of it. All that good stuff.
To that point, I will add, I often write a lot of that stuff on my end when I send the initial offer in the email itself.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I'm writing a novel in that offer email explaining to clients how much they love that.
Yes.
How stable their financial and emotional scenarios are. I get a little bit of that in there when I send them off too.
Yeah, I do the same thing. I try to create the perfect narrative without being too cheesy, just like, I want to hit those high points to make you feel really good about my folks. Yeah. Especially if I've been working with them for a while, or if they've bought multiple homes, like, oh no, these are solid buyers. They listen to my advice. Anything to ease the seller and the listing agent's mind, I think. Well, I think that's it. We've covered a lot of stuff here today. Obviously, we could go spend hours going deeper, which we do teach a home buying class for. So if you are interested, join us at a home buying class. We'll go into depth on some of these things. But that's it for today. Thank you for joining me, Chris. We'll see you next time.